Now on Consciousness Matters, a special episode where we take a deep dive into philosophical idealism with the Bernardo Kastrup Book Club. The Big Bang Theory explains how we get from quarks at the beginning of the universe to, well, smartphones today. In conjunction with evolution, we have the fullest account that we've ever had to explain the world and reality. And the only thing these theories really lack is any accounting for why it feels like something to be us. Now, people have commented that this is a pretty big gap. And the challenge is that we have to account for two things. One, the fact that it feels like something to be us. And two, the fact that we talk about the fact that it feels like something to be us. Now, I'm not needlessly being convoluted here. This is a really important point, because the second point tells us that consciousness changes reality. Otherwise, well, we certainly wouldn't be talking about consciousness. This inescapably makes consciousness a force acting on the world, at the very least. And we're left with the question of, how do we account for that conscious force? Emergence suggests that we should accept the arrival of a brand new force billions of years into the life of the universe, when all other forces are built out of, or are directly, fundamental ones. We need to go somewhere else. Now, panpsychism is the next logical leap, positing some tiny aspect of consciousness to fundamental particles. Does it feel like something to be a quark? Well, this grants us the rationale of building up human consciousness from these elements. However, it doesn't seem to explain conscious force. We need something that not only makes sense of us having conscious experiences, but also allows the top-down causation required for us to talk about them. It's really important. And at this point, it's more helpful to think of matter coming from mind as opposed to mind coming from matter. We land in idealism. Now, in my view, idealism is the top contender so far for a simple explanation of how the force of consciousness acts upon the world. Idealism can be consistent with the data that leads us to theorize evolution and the Big Bang. We simply switch from seeing the universe as a giant machine to seeing it more like a giant mind from which you are a dissociated part. Now, the Western world's leading academic and proponent of idealism, Bernardo Kastrup, holds PhDs in philosophy and computer science, has written 10 books and circulates and mixes with the top people in consciousness research. Okay, that's a bit of a subjective statement, but I believe it to be true. Join me and the Bernardo Kastrup Book Club for a special deep dive episode into philosophical idealism with Bernardo Kastrup himself. If you find any of this material quite difficult or a little bit further ahead than you are, I'd recommend reading the books, but you can always have a look at some of these YouTube videos that I've put in a playlist that should give you an introduction into Bernardo's work.
Welcome everyone, and very special welcome to Bernardo. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's such an honor.
Thanks for having me. My honor.
Just to give some background, because I can see some new faces here, which is very nice. We are the Bernardo Kastrup Book Club. So we've started this book club after doing a course with Bernardo with the Psychedelic Society, and we've been studying his books for the last 2 months. So far we covered 4 books, so we're just so excited to ask him a few questions in the realm of those books. And also, for your reference, the books are Why Materialism is Baloney, Rational Spirituality, and Dreamed Up Reality, which is my favorite, and Meaning and Absurdity. So the way how this session will go is we have a few questions that will lead the session, and Matthew will be leading the discussion. as Bernardo suggested, the person who asked the question will give like a very short introduction of where that question came from and, you know, some explanation about it as well. And I think we're ready to go. So I'm going to hand this over to Matthew.
Right, thank you. Right, so we've decided to split it up into 6 main themes. We're aiming to sort of give each theme about 15 minutes. We were sort of hoping that we could sort of have questions at the start of each theme for the first half of the 15 minutes, and then we could move on to more open discussion for the second part. Right,
Sounds good.
Excellent. The first theme is exploring the mind, and that's going to kick off with Andrew. And Andrew's asking questions. They're a bit longer, so I'll let Andrew ask the questions, but they're basically along the theme of what things feel like across a dissociative boundary. Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So yeah, I was really curious as to sort of like what sort of things the mind at large could be thinking and how we can think about what it does think. So my first question was, if we create something like across our dissociative boundary, for example, like a computer, doesn't it imply that mind at large actually feels something when we actually create it? And if a computer's running, the mind at large will actually have like an experience associated with the running of the computer?
That's correct. That would imply that, yes.
So in that case, is there any way we could actually give information to sort of, I guess, mind at large simply through our creations?
I think we are doing that all the time, whether we like it or not, whether we are aware of it or not. But, you know, my perspective is that what matter is, it is the representation, the extrinsic appearance of a conscious process, a mental process that underlies it. So however we manipulate the material world, that manipulation is the correlate of something that is changing in the inner life of mind at large by virtue of our carrying out that manipulation. So that's, of course, correct. But I would urge you to keep it in perspective. Our manipulating even a whole planet, what is a planet in the context of the universe at its largest scales, which would then be the sort of complete appearance of the inner meditation of mind at large? I mean, it's less than a grain of sand in that broader context. So you could compare that to a whole civilization sitting on one of our synaptic clefts inside our brain, throwing neurotransmitter molecules from one side and the other. Would we register that? At some level, we would. It would contribute in some way to our inner life, but it would probably be extraordinarily small in view of all the rest that is going on. Yeah, so I think you were correct, but if you put it in perspective, I think we would quickly realize the smallness of our impact in that broader context.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on to the second question. It's, if mind at large has a subjective unitary experience of the whole universe, doesn't that imply consciousness defies locality? In other words, a thought at one end of the universe can in some sense sort of like trigger one at the other end.
Yes, that would imply that, because the space and the time we see are our cognitive categories, the way we represent what is out there. And we represent it this way because it has been evolutionarily advantageous for us to sort of encode the world that is outside in a sort of a dashboard of dials. And space and time is the scaffolding of that dashboard. It doesn't mean that space and time are objectively out there as the scaffolding of the world. It's just the way we represent the transpersonal mentation of mind at large that surrounds us. And again, we represent it that way because it has been evolutionarily advantageous, because it allows us to maintain the structural integrity of our body despite the second law of thermodynamics. In other words, everything tends to confusion. If we would mirror the states of mind at large in our own inner perception, our internal states would become too diffuse and we would probably dissolve into an entropic soup. There is a mathematical argument for why perception needs to encode that which is perceived. In other words, what we perceive as the physical world is in fact the dashboard of dials. It's not a transparent window into what is out there. And I think space-time is part of the cognitive scaffolding of that dashboard, of the dials, not of the world out there. Now, the world out there as it is in and of itself, that's the inner life of mind at large. And in that inner life, there is no extension in exactly the same way that you can't say that a thought is longer than another. You could say it's more intense than another, but a thought is not longer or heavier than another. A thought's not going left or right. So yes, I would agree with you from the first person perspective of mind at large. Space and time are probably things that it doesn't know by direct acquaintance. It just has mentation, and therefore the whole point of a locality sort of dissolves. Locality is our own cognitive category.
Right, well, thank you very much. Okay, so moving on to the third question is, if subjective conscious experience from a human perspective holds true if it meets the conditions of Tononi's integrated theory of information, wouldn't it hold that the mind at large would only have like a subjective like experience under those conditions?
I would think, look, the way information integration theory has been defined, you know, they define that quantity phi, which has a mathematical definition, but to establish what the threshold of phi is, across which we can speak of consciousness, they have done that empirically. So they do the measurements, and when the subject reports, oh, I'm having that experience, then they correlate that with the phi that is measured, and they say, okay, from this point on, there is consciousness. But because it's entirely based on subjective reports of experience, what is being actually correlated is not phenomenal consciousness, pure and simple, but it's already metacognitive awareness because the subject has to report on that experience. So not only does the subject have to experience it, the subject also has to know that he or she experiences it, and that's an addition. So information integration theory is telling us by construction, by the way it has been constructed and built up, it tells us about the threshold of metacognition, not the threshold of phenomenal consciousness, pure and simple. So I don't think that in itself implies that mind at large is metacognitive. If I didn't convince you, it's okay that we take this further because we sort of covered all three questions in 5 minutes.
Actually, I wanted to say that, so it's not a very strict Q&A, so feel free to jump into the discussion anytime, you know, to just keep it live discussion. And I wanted to say about the first point that Andrew pointed is how it's very fascinating to think that we can change mind at large in a very in an indirect way by the creations that we make. But then you think, how can that be possible? And from the point that we came from mind at large, we like the source is mind at large, and now we are the product of that source, and now the product is changing the source.
I think it's not incoherent to say that. I mean, we have to keep in mind that the core subjectivity, me and you and everybody and mind at large, is the same in the sense that the subject who looks to the world through our eyes is the same in me and you and everybody else. These are more or less the words of Schopenhauer. I'm sort of paraphrasing him. What we identify ourselves with when we think of ourselves as individuals is not that core subjectivity, it's not those eyes that are looking at the world through us. We identify with particular contents of perception, particular contents of thinking and feeling and so on. So it's not the eye, but what the eye sees that we identify with. We identify with our particular perspective in 3 dimensions or in 4 dimensions, space and time. So from that perspective of core subjectivity, you are entirely correct. There is only one subject going on here. It is dissociated, all right, almost by definition, but there is only one subject, one core subjectivity experiencing all points of view and all narratives. But if you accept that and you move one level higher in the illusion of being, my individual field of experience is not identical to yours. I can't read your thoughts. I don't know how you're feeling right now. And even if I know, I can't become directly acquainted with how you're feeling right now. So at this more or less illusory level of there being multiple subjects, we can talk of dissociated subjects modulating the experience of mind at large across their respective dissociative boundaries by leaving a footprint in the physical world. I think that is certainly true. I mean, the physical world impacts what I experience, right, from across my dissociative boundary. If there is a storm tomorrow, that storm will impact my experience. I will hear different things, I will see different things, I will feel different temperatures and humidity in the air. My thoughts will be different because they will also be modulated by what's going on outside. So my experience is modulated by the world around me, which of course is much bigger than me as an individual subject. But in principle, maybe not in practice, but in principle at least, we can say that the footprint I leave in the world, by acting in the world, by moving things around, by constructing things, by destroying things, I also influence or modulate to a very, very, very tiny, maybe insignificant degree, the inner experience of mind at large, because dissociation is a symmetrical process, maybe not in quantity or intensity of experience, but it's symmetrical in principle, in the sense that both sides of the dissociation can impinge on the other by acting across a dissociative boundary. So I think in principle, it is correct to say that. The question is this significant at all from the point of view of mind at large? I would say it isn't significant. It wouldn't even remotely cross the threshold of our awareness if you would equate us to mind at large for the sake of argument. It would be so small that probably we wouldn't even register it explicitly in our awareness, even though it would change something infinitesimally small as it might be in our experience.
Thank you.
Right. I think from just leading on to the questions that I was sort of going to ask, but I think you've sort of already started to cover some of it. I think from reading through the books that we've done, that there's two main questions that have popped up for me. And the first one of them is going back to the metacognition. It's sort of how can we be sure that mind at large is not metacognitive? I think the thing that really confuses me on this one, and perhaps this is the thing that will be the most helpful for everyone, is I find it really, I find it some of the hardest questions that I can ask is things like, how is it that I'm aware that I'm aware? And it's that one step beyond an already confusing question. And I think that when I've tried to sort of reflect on this, it's probably been when I've been listening to Daniel Dennett. I've been really trying to, as seriously as possible, consider the idea that consciousness is an illusion. And I find myself almost completely devoid of thoughts, just experiencing, and sort of almost realizing it doesn't almost feel like the sort of thing that you can sort of rationalize by using the world as a tool. But yeah, I suppose.
So what can't you rationalize?
How is it that I'm aware that I'm aware? How does that's what I'm having trouble with.
This is something we can conceptualize. Whether we can really understand in the bone how this happens is a different question, but we can coherently conceptualize it via the concept of re-representation. The idea is that your raw perceptions, forget for the moment endogenous experiential states like thoughts and emotions that arise within yourself, regardless of what you're perceiving. Focus on perception for now. Our perceptual states are representations of something in the world out there that we are perceiving. So they are representations. They point to something outside, although they are felt inside our perceptions. When your consciousness turns in upon itself in order to perceive its own perceptions, what happens is that those original representations are themselves represented. So what you get is a re-representation of the contents of perception. You get a new experiential state that, although different from the original, it points to the original, like pointers in computer programming, which are not variables in themselves, but they do point to addresses that contain variable values. So from, and that's, I'm being a little bit prejudiced here because of my own background, from a computer science perspective, this is very easily and clearly conceptualizable. It entails a turning in of consciousness upon itself in order to objectify its own contents via other contents of consciousness that serve as pointers. The more you turn in upon yourself, the more you re-represent or objectify the contents of your own mentation. And there are whole spiritual traditions, especially in the East, that are focused on bringing this process of re-representation as far as you can possibly go. Because at the end of that, when you reach a certain limit, the whole thing is supposed to implode into enlightenment. I don't know exactly how that works because I'm not enlightened, but it has to do with that. It's called self-inquiry. That's the name they give it. When you make the effort to turn in your own consciousness upon itself in order to become explicitly aware of your thoughts, your emotions, your perceptions, your feelings. And that brings your awareness to a level in which at some point you're supposed to realize that it's all a kind of illusion, that it's sort of mind telling stories to itself, conjuring things up for itself in order to construct reality, the world we experience. I don't know exactly how that works, but it's the same appeal to conscious metacognition that we are talking about here. Now, I gave you a conceptual elaboration of this, which I think is clear enough that we can even model mathematically or in computer languages, which are unambiguous. But whether we can really, really comprehend that in our bones, that's a different challenge. Speaking for myself, I have had experiences in which that has become very clear to me, this turning in of mind upon itself to re-represent its own representations, which can happen in many levels. You can have, you know, re-representations and re-representations, and you can go on that, becoming ever more explicitly aware of everything in your awareness. There is no end to that. So I don't struggle with really understanding that, because I have had the chance, maybe I don't know, by chance, by luck, I don't know, of becoming directly acquainted with how that process unfolds exactly, and how does it feel when it's not there. So I don't struggle with that, but I can't convey that to you. I can only convey the conceptual articulation.
Does it perhaps have something to do with the possibility that we can ask questions?
Absolutely, absolutely. When you are in an ordinary dream, in which we know now since 2007, research has indicated that we have much reduced metacognition during the dream. We only develop metacognition about the dream contents after we wake up and remember the dream. Only then does that become metacognitive. But during the dream itself, our metacognition is much reduced. And notice that during the dream itself, we are conspicuously incapable of asking relevant questions like, what am I doing here? How did I arrive here? Who are these people? If we were metacognitive, we would ask those questions, and then the dream would sort of collapse, because the whole continuity of our conscious life would become obviously faulty, and the whole dream would collapse. So yes, I think the capacity to ask questions, especially questions that reference the self. What am I doing here? How did I land here? Why am I doing this? You know, these self-referential questions, there's a one-to-one correlation with metacognition.
Might this be conceptualized in terms of Bohr's principle of complementarity and sort of a paradox of speculative pragmatism, that is, that one is both acting and receiving, you know, acting and watching at the same time, observed and observer?
I think you can, but I don't think we need to go that far. This is easily conceptualizable, for instance, in a very unambiguous, rigorous way through the idea of pointers in computer science. Variables that aren't variables, that just contain an address that points to another variable. And that address itself is stored in an address. So the whole thing can become very recursive and self-referential. I think that's enough to understand metacognition, but I think I know why you're saying that. I think I know. If you take this to the limit,
Yes,
you end up in a system which is fundamentally self-referential. So yes, I would go along with your intuition, but I don't think we need to take everybody there for people to understand the concept of metacognition. People don't need to go that far to have a grip on it.
Thank you for the answer to that. I'm not sure personally I'm closer to totally getting it, but I appreciate the response. Thank you.
Can I just add, yes, some of us were discussing a few days ago whether metacognition might be related to the ability to speak in language, and whether perhaps the origin of language is relevant to the origin of metacognition in human beings.
Yeah, when you said speaking languages, you don't mean the speaking in languages, like saying stuff in languages that you don't know, right? You mean it literally.
No, just,
okay, sorry.
just normal language, yeah.
To speak, to have language, we need what cognitive scientists call symbolic thinking. We need the ability to replace a content of consciousness with a label that represents it in an abstract way. I mean, our perception are already representations of the world, but you can represent your perceptions through symbols. You can represent the perception of a tree with the word tree. And that word becomes a sign. Cognitive scientists would call it a symbol. I think it's a bad name. It's a sign. A symbol is something else. A symbol points to transcendence. So I'll stick to sign. We have to think in terms of signs, of labels that stand for something else. Not something else transcendent, but something else that would take much longer and would be a lot more difficult to convey if we didn't have a handy label for it. Now, we start thinking in terms of those signs as well. And this thinking in terms of sign is metacognitive in the sense that it is introspectively accessible. So there is definitely a strong link between metacognition and the ability to speak languages, the ability to have language and to think in terms of language. Absolutely, there is a link. How far that link goes, I'm not sure, and I'm probably not qualified to say how far that goes. That would probably be a subject that can be better addressed by linguists and cognitive scientists, but that the link is there is undeniable.
Sorry.
But do you think, Bernardo, that in the future, we may have some kind of the different higher order cognition processes, not like the self-referential one, but the different type? You have that feeling that, you know,
Can you give an example of the different type?
I don't know. In the future, we don't know how can we evolve, but do you have any sense that is it possible, and in which direction may it go?
This is one of those cases in which to predict the future, it's best to look to the past, right? And if you look to the past, the arrow of evolution seems to have a very, very clear preferential direction, and that direction is more and more and more metacognition. We pay a huge price for it because metacognition is what makes us suffer. If we weren't metacognitive, we would be always in the present, and we would experience pain but not suffering. It has granted us the ability to sort of have domain over the planet, control the planet to some extent, certainly other forms of life. So the arrow seems to be pointing in that direction. We are at a very tricky moment in that process right now, because we have enough metacognition to be capable of destroying ourselves, but we don't have metacognition enough to be wise in the way we go about our business in the planet. In other words, we are not explicitly aware of our own shadow at all. At all. It's amazing how blind people are to their own intrinsic potentials, and how easily they project that on other people and say, they are the bad ones, we are the good guys. And our blind spots are astounding as a species. So I think the process is going in a direction in which our own shadow will become metacognized, and then we go like, oh, that will sober us up. Like, oh my God, all right. I don't know how long that will take. I just hope we survive as a civilization until then. We will survive as a species, because if everything goes to hell, there is the Australian Aboriginal, there is the African Bushman, there is the Inuit. They have the skills to survive outside the context of a civilization. Arguably, they are less metacognitive than us. I think this is objectively verifiable. That goes to some extent in their favor because they are less harmful to their environment. The less metacognition you have, the more you are integrated into the natural flow of instinct. It's the way you will naturally act. When you develop metacognition, you sort of stand out of yourself and you start questioning what naturally would normally flow through you, the actions that would normally flow through you. And you take a step away from that and you rethink that. And then you become out of step with the rhythm of life in a way. The way to recover our ability to operate in sync with the rhythms of nature would either be to get rid of metacognition or to develop metacognition to an extent that will become metacognitive even of that, even of the natural instinct, the natural instinctive flows of nature. It's a question of, will we have time or will we kill ourselves as a civilization in the meantime? I think the question is that there is no answer to that question. I think the jury is out. We'll see.
So I think so the last question for this theme, unless we can go back at the end, because we're just sort of, I know we're sort of moving on time-wise, but that's, I forgot, if so, my understanding is that dissociation, in the model that you've put forward, is that dissociation is caused by metabolism, or have I got that wrong? Was it more correlated with metabolism? I
think metabolism is the extrinsic appearance, the image, the outside image of a dissociative process in universal consciousness. So it's not caused by it, it's what it looks like from across its own dissociative boundary.
I think the thinking through that concept sort of made me wonder more if, because I'm going to say that I'm metabolizing while I'm sleeping. Does that mean that I'm dissociated and sort of conscious, but not remembering what I'm doing while I'm sleeping? It was just an interesting thought.
I think latest research indicates that you are never really unconscious during sleep. Even when you're not dreaming, there are at least 3 categories of sleep experiences that are not dream experiences. This is all very recent because neuroimaging only recently has become such a big thing. But research has indicated that. So I think for as long as you're metabolizing, not only are you always experiencing, you're always experiencing anyway, dead or alive. But for as long as you're metabolizing, you're always experiencing dissociated conscious processes, dissociated from the rest of universal consciousness. In other words, from mind at large.
Thank you.
Sorry, is it okay if I slide in a last question?
We can, but the more questions we have at this point, we risk running out. We risk not being able to cover all the themes. Is it something that can wait until we've got to the end of the themes and we open it up more after that?
It's a computer science question, so I don't know which will fit.
We have an hour. Should be okay, right? I mean, I stay here a little longer if we need to.
Should I ask away? Okay. Hi Bernardo. I don't know if
Hi.
you're a fan of the sustain model back in 2004 in terms of concept acquisition, but I happen to come across the authors.
Say it again, which model?
Sustain. So
Sustain.
yeah,
I'm not aware of it.
It's a computer science model of concept acquisition, but more recently the authors suggest that it is possible to acquire concept and solve Quine's referential problem if you take a late Wittgensteinian stance on this and sort of coherent,
Language games.
And if you use unsupervised learning and take cortex, speech, the environment, location, just everything, a holistic picture that the model training data has, the model shows that concepts are able to be acquired. So do you think that will shed some new light on the issue?
Let me give you just an intro for everybody else, because you asked the question in technical terms and I'm not sure people have followed. So in computer science, in artificial intelligence, there are two modalities of, this is metaphorical, what I'm about to say, teaching a machine how to solve certain problems or how to recognize certain things in order to solve certain problems. One is called supervised learning and the other unsupervised learning. In supervised learning, you teach the machine by showing examples that are already solved. Like if you show several pictures containing faces and you tell the machine, this is a face, this is another face, and you show many of those examples, at some point the machine is able to recognize faces by itself. There is no teaching involved. These are just calculations that are inspired in the way the human brain processes data, in the same way that an airplane was inspired in birds. That doesn't mean that the airplane is a bird. And an AI computer is not a brain. It just does things in a way that is inspired by the brain. So one way is supervised learning, but it requires us to teach the machines the categories that we already know. We already know the concepts and the categories like faces, traffic signs, cars, trees, houses, and we teach the machine to identify those based on our knowledge of those. The other category of AI is when you don't teach the machine anything, you just give the machine data, and the machine will start doing cuts in a sort of hyperdimensional space of that data in order to identify different categories based on similarities and dissimilarities between different data points. And the machine will naturally converge to certain categories that we may recognize ourselves as things that we also consider categories, or the machine may find categories that we are totally unaware of, just based on the similarities and the dissimilarities of the data. And her question has to do with the way we use concepts. Can the machine learn concepts without our teaching the machine our own concepts? In a sense that Wittgenstein proposed at the end. Wittgenstein in his life, the early Wittgenstein was a positivist. The late Wittgenstein was an anti-positivist. He sort of said that everything he did earlier was nonsense, and he sort of contradicted his own earlier book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He never wrote a second book, but people posthumously put together a book for him. And there he says that our philosophical categories are the very origin of our philosophical problems, that we created the problems we are trying to solve, and that concepts, in fact, are language games. They only have meaning in the context of other concepts, and there are similarities and the dissimilarities. So the context gives meaning to our concepts. They are not absolute natural categories, and that's why we invent our own problems, because of these language games that we create. And now your question was, could the machine learn through unsupervised learning to derive this conceptual space, this categorical space? Now I'll finally give you the answer, and the answer will be surprisingly short in comparison to the explanation of the question. Yes, I think that is possible. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Right, okay. Well, for the second theme, we've got the relationship between mind and matter. And well, Noor's got quite a question here, so I'd just like to hand over to Noor.
Yeah, I've written like a very short introduction for my question, but it doesn't actually seem very short. So you know, like Bernardo, how you said we start off by what's given to us, and then we go on and build our theory. We don't start off from the theory. Now, in your book, like Why Materialism is Baloney, there was when you introduced consciousness to be like an ontological primitive that is irreducible. You said that you're saying that as the like mind is independent of matter, it's like mind is by and of itself. There's something like along the line of that. So when you said like mind and matter are independent, I think that's where I have the issue. So you know, like how you said in your theory that everything we have in life is through like experience, and any experience has an intrinsic and extrinsic aspect. So isn't it more parsimonious to say that mind and matter are inseparable rather than independent, because we as dissociated alters, all what we can experience is the the matter that we can view from our perceptions, but we have never experienced a universal consciousness to be at rest. It's because it's always vibrating, and that's where like we can say that's how life came into existence. So I don't know if I made myself clear, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I get where you're coming from. We are speaking dualist language here, mind and matter. I'm not a dualist. I don't believe you are either. When we say mind and matter from an idealist perspective, what we mean is the category of experience that we normally label matter and the other categories of experience. Matter are the contents of perception. I don't deny that what people refer to when they use the word matter exists. It obviously exists. I mean, I can call this mouse material. It's solid, I can feel it, it has weight. So matter, meaning the contents of perception, obviously exists. Those things we refer to when we talk about matter obviously exist, but they are experiences. They are perceptual experiences. They have quality, such as concreteness, qualities such as concreteness, weight, texture, temperature, color, right? So I don't deny that colloquial use or meaning of the word matter. It's undeniable. I would be a fool to deny that. What I deny is how we define matter theoretically. We replace a description of matter for the very definition of matter. We describe the contents of perception with handy numbers like mass, charge, momentum, frequency, amplitude. But at some point, this weird thing happened that people thought that instead of descriptions of matter, those numbers were matter, and that the contents of perception were somehow arose out of those lists of numbers, out of those descriptions. In other words, we had the territory. That's where we all started from. Then we drew a very handy map of the territory that has unquestionable usefulness. But then at some point we said to ourselves, what really exists is the map, and the territory is a side effect of the map. And then we went crazy. That's the moment we went crazy. And this is materialism. I deny the materialist metaphysical definition of matter. What materialists say is that a list of numbers, a list of quantities exhaustively define matter. In other words, a list of numbers say everything there is to be said about matter. They replaced that which is described with its description. And they said the description is primary and the thing described is secondary. That's nonsensical. So this is how I reject matter, but I don't reject the perceptual experiences we label material. Of course I don't reject that. It's an experience that we all have. It's undeniable. Now, how do I then interpret that experience metaphysically? I would say matter, all matter, not only the matter in your nervous system, is the extrinsic appearance of inner experience as observed from across a dissociative boundary. That's what matter is. And therefore, from a metaphysical perspective, I'm not a dualist. Even though I talk of mind and matter colloquially, because I'm talking about two different categories of experience, ontologically, I only acknowledge that there is experience. So I'm not a dualist. So I don't really say that the mind is separate from matter, because I don't think there is this metaphysical distinction. There is only a colloquial distinction. The metaphysical distinction is not there. What we call matter is just what certain experiences look like from across a dissociative boundary. That's all there is to it. There is only mind and multiple modalities of experience.
Right. And do you consider endogenous experimental states to be an experience? And it's one of those experiences that only have an intrinsic aspect. They are not represented. So if mind at large has endogenous or having endogenous mental states, do they have representations, or could they not have representations?
I think what we call the inanimate or non-organic physical universe is the appearance, the extrinsic appearance of endogenous transpersonal experiential states in mind at large. I think that's what the inanimate universe is. It's the representation of that endogenous inner life.
Right. And what about us as alters because we are already, as a body, we're already representations of that dissociation. So if I had an endogenous mental state, does it have a representation, or is it like a recursive cycle?
But that is your body.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. Look, I think a lot of our endogenous states do trickle through to representation, and they are visible from the outside. I think, to use a very common example that maybe not the best one, a lie detector test leverages exactly that. They look at your physiological response as a representation of your inner experience, because a lying is an experience that we feel from the inside. And guess what? There is an external representation of that. There is a cue perceivable from the outside about what's going on the inside. To feel sad is an endogenous experience, right? Sadness is not out there in the world. It's not perceived. It's felt from within. It arises within us. But when we feel sad, we often cry. And what is crying other than a representation of that inner state? A sort of, when you sort of give away how you're feeling from the inside by letting it be represented on the outside. Many of our physiological parameters give tremendous cues about how we are actually feeling from within, even if we are not metacognitively aware of what we are feeling. I just ended a 24-year-long career in the high-tech world, both in corporate and all kinds of other things that you don't want to know about. And it is surprising in that world how little metacognitive awareness people have of how they are actually feeling from within. Sometimes, once you develop the ability to sense that, to pick up on the cues, it is scary sometimes that so many people are in a kind of autopilot, totally unaware of what they are really feeling. Now, having said that, so I'm arguing that our endogenous experiences do have extrinsic images or representations. Now, I do not know whether all of our endogenous experiences are extrinsically represented, because I think it's perfectly conceivable and theoretically coherent that the extrinsic appearance is not complete. In other words, that doesn't contain all the information that corresponds to our inner state. I don't see any reason, theoretical, evolutionary, logical, I don't see any reason to state that the extrinsic representation of our inner state is complete, that it contains all relevant information about our inner state. I don't think that's necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, if I am to issue an opinion, I would say most likely that's not the case. How many images of processes in nature are complete? I mean, not many. There's a lot still that that we don't get access to from an outside perspective. So I think chances are that our bodies do not contain all information relevant to finding out how we feel from the inside, but it certainly contains some relevant information about our endogenous inner states, I think.
Could I jump in for a second? Because Noah was asking me the same question, and another question rose to me when I was trying to answer, which is that if space and time are only the conditions of representation, and sort of mind itself is outside of space and time, then is dissociation in mind a process that has its own, first person space and time, or does space and time only arise when it's represented?
I think it only arises as part of the process of representation. I don't think space and time are intrinsic. Big cues for it, big clues, is that nobody can give you a non-circular definition of time. Nobody alive can give you a non-circular definition of time. Nobody can tell you what time is without using time indirectly in that very definition. People say, oh, time is the period that elapses between two events. Well, a period that elapses is time already. So you're defining time in terms of time. Same goes for space. Space is the distance between two objects. Yeah, but distance is another word for space. We do not have non-circular definitions of space-time. We only have a feeling for it, an intuition for it. That's a big clue that we are talking about the scaffolding of representation, not an objective reality.
But I would strongly argue that time and space are not equivalent. That time actually has a very different character than space.
There's a lot of science suggesting the opposite, starting from the theory of relativity, which made space and time inextricably linked. You could say that space only makes sense if you have time, because if there is no time, then there is no time that it takes for you to go from A to B. So you are in A and B at the same time. So there's no space.
Well, I see time in terms of motion and dynamicism.
But that's the thing, it's circular as well. What is motion but a change of states in time? What is dynamicism but a change of states in time? You can't define motion and dynamicism. You can't define change without surreptitiously using time in that very definition. That's the tricky thing.
Could you say
there is no time, there's only change. Okay, what's change? Oh, it's a change of states. It's a transition of states in time. There you go. I mean, you can add layers and layers and layers of indirection so to hide the circularity of our definitions. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult to get rid of it.
Could you say that if we try to think of sort of what's happening in mind prior to representation, so prior to physical manifestation, and we can think using your whirlpool analogy of a river with whirlpools which correspond to dissociated alters, then even when we're doing that, I suppose we are immediately already conceptualizing it and representing it to ourselves, and therefore we can't get past the spatialization of it, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. We are, the moment we open our mouths, the moment we think conceptually, the moment we reason, we are already directly acknowledging space and time, because we think in terms of space and time. If there were no space and no time, there wouldn't be a distinction of categories. And without a distinction of categories, if everything would collapse on top of each other, we couldn't think, because thinking, analysis is about discerning categories and then trying to sew them back together through logical bridges or empirical bridges, finding the relationships between those categories that we already sort of pulled apart. So if I open my mouth, I have to speak in terms of space and time. If I argue or if I reason, I have to acknowledge, to grant at least metaphorically, that there is space and time, because I think in terms of space and time. Our language already encodes space and time. Think of verbs, they are temporal. Think of the distinction between object and subject, that's spatial. So space and time are built into our way of reasoning and in our very language. I wrote, at least in a couple of places, it's discrete, but I said, the fact that space and time are not absolute doesn't render our reasoning pointless. We only have to be aware that our reasoning works in terms of projections. There is something outside space and time that we can point to from within space and time. In other words, that extra spatial temporal reality projects itself onto space and time like a shadow projects itself on a wall. The shadow is not the reality. The reality is the object in 3D that casts the shadow. But you can make reasonable statements about that object within the world of shadows. So we are in the world of shadows and when we reason, because we reason in terms of space and time. But that doesn't mean that our reasoning is pointless. We have to acknowledge the limitation. We are not talking about the thing in itself. We are talking about the representations of the thing in itself in space and time, because that's how we reason. But the moment we acknowledge that, there is still some value to our reasoning. It's not pointless. It's not useless.
Thank you. Right. Well, I think now is probably a good time to ask MJ if the question that she had regarding the brain and physiology has already sort of been covered, or is there anything there that you want to sort of expand upon from what we've just been talking about previously, MJ?
Yes, some of it was covered, but I'd like to just expand a little bit on it, if I may. Let me just find my question. Here it is. Bernardo, in your earlier books, I've noticed that you mentioned the brain, but then in your more recent ones, it no longer features, and we only have mind and then mind at large. Are the terms brain and mind used as synonyms, or is there a difference? So that would be my first question, and if you could just briefly answer that, please, that would be brilliant, and I'll just...
I think the brain, the nervous system, is a representation, an extrinsic appearance of certain mental processes within universal consciousness, namely dissociative mental processes in universal consciousness. Those processes are natural processes, and every natural process has an image. Every natural process has something it looks like. And in the case of those dissociative processes, what it looks like is, well, a brain, a nervous system.
Exactly. Now, we know that the brain is an image created with the collapse of the wave function of consciousness. And then it is used as a transceiver tool or interface for interaction with the physical world. Now, my question is, does the brain anatomy and physiology affect the quality of our experience without conditioning or psychedelics influence or any physical damage?
I think that's an empirical.
And does it determine the level of intelligence or understanding, for instance?
That's an empirical question. I don't think it's even philosophical. Look, the filter analogy or the receiver analogy of consciousness, I use it just as that, as an analogy. If you interpret it literally, you fall straight into dualism. You talk about the brain being one thing and the mind being another. So the brain is a television receiver and the mind is the broadcast signal that gets picked up by the receiver. I think that's ultimately wrong, because I don't think there are two things going on. I think there is only one thing. So in Why Materialism is Baloney, I talk of the brain as a transceiver, and I think I do that in rationalist spirituality as well.
Spirituality, yes. Yeah.
But I think in both cases, I sort of insist, I go out of my way to tell people this is just an analogy for people who are not acquainted with idealism, who find it difficult to think in terms of non-dual terms. So it's an entry point for them to start thinking about it in dualist terms, analogically, but then ultimately realizing that the brain is not a receiver of anything. It's not a transmitter of anything. It is the image of a localization of something. It is what that localization process looks like. It's not the means by which consciousness is received. It's the way a certain conscious configuration looks like. It's the image of the process. Now, does that image of the process correlate with the particularities of the process? Surely it's the image of the process, so it will correlate with the particularities of the process, whatever those particularities are. I think the danger is in misinterpreting that correlation, to say that people with only residuals of a brain, like people with hydrocephaly, because they have very little brain mass, that they are necessarily stupid. Well, empirically, we know that's not the case. People can have normal levels, even high levels of intelligence with very little brain mass. So I don't think we understand yet that correlation well enough to make it a reliable translation between the image and what it feels like from the inside. I think we are still far from that. But I think one day we will get there. One day we will be able to take a full brain scan and we will be able to infer a lot, maybe not everything, because images are not necessarily complete. They don't necessarily have all the information, but we will be able to infer, I think, a lot more than we can do today. And I look forward to that, because what's happening right now is the inference is so unreliable that it's leading to all kinds of misinterpretations and even dangerous interpretations of people trying to infer too much about another based on images. That is dangerous until we understand the process better.
Okay, thank you. That was very clear.
Right, well, I'd sort of like to open it up a bit more at this point. What I am mindful of at the moment, though, is we've covered 2 of our 6 themes. We've taken an hour to do it. So has anyone got any burning questions with regards to this particular section?
Maybe just one question. Christian, is that the same cat that Bernardo was having there passing by, or is that just walking from? Sorry, silly question.
I don't know. Different colors, I think. She's she. I don't know if Bernardo is she or he.
My cat here, the ones you guys saw is a he, but there are 2 female cats around here.
Okay.
So.
Great. Bernardo, my background is in brain imaging and brain physiology. Actually, I'm a physician who does brain injury research. And it seems to me that there are some fundamental things about the vertebrate brain, and particularly the cerebrum, that give us some clues about, what might be going on. The fact that we have 2 separate cerebral hemispheres that are linked together by a large bundle of fibers. So there's 3 fundamental elements: the 2 hemispheres and the fibers that link the 2. Is that a clue to how things may work? I personally believe it is. I mean, I've read the book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist.
I have it here behind me.
And it's a magnificent book. I've been in touch with him. I think he has some very important ideas. I think, in fact, that the right hemisphere is the master hemisphere, because it is relational. It is, it is involved in relationship, even though it doesn't speak. The left hemisphere, which we have empowered since Descartes, is causing a lot of problems for us, because it fragments, because its underlying issue is taking things apart, whereas the right hemisphere is putting things back together again. And I think there's some clues there.
But yes, I think so too. I would even go further, and I would say it's a direct implication of interpreting the brain as a partial image of the individual mind, that this image necessarily carries clues about that mind it's an image of. The image of a process necessarily carries clues about the process that it's an image of. So and the lateralization that you're alluding to, the anatomy of the brain, and there are other clues, and we are talking about the cerebrum, but the cerebellum has most of our neurons, and it seems to have a purely motor function that is totally under the threshold of introspection. So what's going on there? The thalamus is a great mystery. It's role in memory. Why is it that structure that goes around both sides of the brain, and what exactly is its role? So I think there is an abundance of clues in there, so much so that we sort of get confused. Lateralization is a big one. I agree with you that at least in the Western society and now worldwide, because we sort of infected the whole world with our way of thinking, sort of overemphasizes the left hemisphere. I would be cautious also about saying that you should go all the way to the other side, because one of the characteristics of schizophrenia is finding relations that are not there and getting swamped by all kind of deluded relationships that you can identify everywhere, and that's also probably not very functional, right? And it's probably stressful from the inside as well. But we definitely overshot the point of balance in Western society. And yes, the brain is a big clue, absolutely.
Right, well, I think moving on to the third theme of tonight, we've got will and free will. And so I think I'll just hand this over to Christian.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Hello, Bernardo.
Hi there.
Nice to see you. And I would like to go only to the free will now, to the will now, because we are limited in time, I think so. So let me just introduce to this question. So I have to say that generally I agree with almost of your all ontology, but there are some issues that makes me wonder that the will exactly, the free will, and the time and dependence between them. So let's go to the will, and its, let's say, ontological status and structure of the will, regarded as a Schopenhauer will. And in your last book, Decoding Schopenhauer Metaphysics, following the famous philosopher, you define will as all there is. So it is analogous to your ontology, to the mind at large. But even though these two words means the same, we mentioned that because we are deeply rooted in the language and things in the categories of language, it evokes slightly different feelings and imagination. For me, for example, the will is more about the impetus, action, whereas the mind at large is more about the wholeness, which fills and transcends everything. For this brief discussion, let me use the term will, which for me better express the action, which is more humanistic, let's say. But go to the point. According to the Schopenhauer will, affects, behaves, feels according to the certain archetypes, which imprints part in our world, and which we are constantly discovering that imprints as a law of nature. And we are as we are because the will is what it is. But for me, that view seems to be a bit limiting, because it seems to not realizing its full potential of the will. In this view seems only exist that which is determined by the exact will which we feel, which we see in our world. I rather would like to think about a will as an unlimited potential from and in which everything can exist, everything. So the question is now, why the will behaves according to that, not the different sets of archetypes, or maybe the will, which as a representation appears in our world, is only the sub-will of the broader will. So our will can be reduced to this broader will. And how many archetypes we are talking about, infinite or finite? Because in my opinion, it should be only a few archetypes. The less the better, which in this sense can be simple and analogous, for example, to the equation of the deterministic chaos or cell automats that in results can lead to the very complicated structures like fractals and etc. Can you elaborate on it?
I follow you. There's a lot to unpack in your question, because there are many questions folded in your question. I'll try to start from the beginning. Let's keep in mind that Schopenhauer's usage of the word will is one thing, but his conception of what he called the will is not limited, shouldn't be interpreted as being limited to our own understanding of that word. Schopenhauer wrote in an extraordinarily informal terms for his time. I mean, remember, this guy is a contemporary of Hegel. Did you ever, I mean, you're German, Polish, I think you are, German, East German?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm Polish.
You're
yeah.
Polish, okay.
Yeah.
So I picked up your accent more or less correct.
Yeah. But Schopenhauer was born in Gdańsk, so
exactly.
now he's in Poland. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I'm getting to. So, why did I even ask this question? I sort of lost my train of thought. Okay, Schopenhauer was trying to address regular people. He's a contemporary of Hegel, and if you try to pick up a book by Hegel in German and you try to read it, I mean, my German is very poor, so it's understandable, but I know many native speakers of German who pick up that book and go like, oh my God, forget about it. I mean, sometimes there are sentences, I don't know whether the rest of you know, but in languages like Dutch, German, even Latin, the objects in secondary sentences come first and the verbs go to the end. And if you start nesting sentence within sentence, you get like 5, 6, 7 verbs at the end sometimes. I mean, Hegel, I think he has crossed the boundary of 10 sometimes, and 10 verbs, one after the other at the end, and you don't remember anymore which verb goes with which subject. It's a complete mess. So this is the time that Schopenhauer was active and alive. And if you pick up his books, it's like he's talking informally in a bar with somebody else, verbally, not in writing. So he makes an extraordinary effort for his time to be accessible to the normal people, to the normal person, speaking normal colloquial language. And that's a benefit and a liability. It's a benefit because we understand him, and it's a liability because we tend then to misunderstand him the moment we try to interpret it too literally and too unambiguous. He picked this term will because he needed to evoke in us readers, regular readers, the image of endogenous mental processes. Because mental processes that are not endogenous are perceptual, and perception is representation. So that which is not representation has to be endogenous. And what are the most evocative endogenous experiential states we have? It's our fears and desires. They are, I mean, thoughts, yeah, that too. But if you really want to appeal to a gut intuition about what might be going on out there, you appeal to the will, to fear and desire. Because not only is that endogenous, that compels action. If you're not fearful and you don't desire anything, nothing changes. You don't do anything. Yet the universe is clearly doing something. It's evolving, it's active, it's dynamic. So Schopenhauer figured, I'm trying to put words in his mouth now. If he's watching me from outside space and time, please forgive me, Chopi. I'm doing my best here. He figured, how do I appeal to that intuition in a regular person? It's the word will. But then we have to be careful not to overinterpret that. I think what he meant is that what is underlying all representations, what is really out there, are endogenous experiential states that provide an impetus for action. Now, he didn't write what I just said because it would be boring and it wouldn't appeal to the regular person. But that's what I think he meant. And then you might say, well, but if all there is the will, then what about representation? Well, representation is just what the will looks like from a certain perspective. So at the end of the day, it's all will, but Schopenhauer uses the word ambiguously, depending on context. When he's talking about the ontological category of existence, he uses the word will as an absolute. When he's talking about categories of a personal experience, then he contrasts will against representation. Our inner will, our endogenous experiential states. And representations are our experiential states that correspond to perception. But what is underlying both of them is the will, the unitary will. And representation is that too, in the sense that it's an image of that from an individual point of view, an individual perspective. Now I'm going to go to the second part of your question, which is it a limited set of archetypes according to which the will wills, or is it infinite archetypes? Jung, who was also a student of Schopenhauer, was inspired by Schopenhauer in many ways, not only Nietzsche, Jung as well. At some point in his life, in his late life, which is the more reliable part of his life, he said, there are infinite archetypes. And then you might say, well, then the archetypes don't tell us anything because there are infinite ones. Well, go back to quantum mechanics, which Jung was also aware of because of his close relationship with Wolfgang Pauli. Quantum mechanics would also tell you that yeah, there are infinite possibilities, but what actually happens tends probabilistically to some of those possibilities. And I think that's the way to interpret the archetypes in the way the will manifests itself. Yes, there are theoretically or in principle infinite archetypes, but those infinite archetypes don't manifest with equal probabilities. There are some archetypes that clearly occur with a higher probability because they manifest more visibly, they are more obvious. We see more recurrences of that archetypal pattern of behavior in nature. So I think that's what tentatively reconciles the contrast you try to establish between an infinitude of archetypes and predictable behavior. The predictable behavior doesn't come from the possibility that there are finite set of archetypes. It probably comes from the idea that some of an infinite set of archetypes have clearly higher probability of manifestation. And you might ask, well, but why do they have higher probabilities of manifestation? Well, because that's how nature is. At some point we hit rock bottom and we can't reduce things anymore, and we just have to accept that this is what nature is. Whatever is, in other words, whatever exists has properties. It can't be said to exist without any property. Something that has no properties doesn't exist. So if the world, the universe, mind at large, or the universal consciousness, or the will, if it exists, it has properties. And those properties can be associated with the probabilities of manifestation of the intrinsic potentials, the intrinsic archetypes or modes of probable behavior of the will. I don't know whether this answer is satisfactory to you.
Yeah, it's very satisfactory. So the implication of that is that if we've got these infinite numbers of the archetypes, it covers all possibilities. It covers all it may be created. For example, it may be represented. So for example, for the parallel universe, the different sets, the different probabilities to these archetypes may occur. Do I get it properly, or?
This is conceivable. And if you belong to the school of philosophy that says that conceivability implies metaphysical possibility, there is a whole discussion about this. You don't want to know how much hair splitting is in analytic philosophy these days. I'm just trying to be rigorous in my answer to you. So I think what you just said is conceivable. I belong to the school that conceivable entails metaphysical possibility. So I think it is metaphysically possible. Whether it's a metaphysical reality is a whole other question. I don't see anecdotal evidence that this is a metaphysical reality, but I grant its possibility.
Yeah, we don't see the effects in our nature. Yeah,
at least not ordinarily. Some would say that some psychedelic trances provide evidence to parallel realities in which the archetypes manifest themselves according to very different distributions of probability. But then the question is, how do you really, I don't want to use the word seriously, but how do you interpret psychedelic gnosis? Do you interpret it as reflecting a metaphysical reality, or do you interpret it as mind telling stories to itself, stories that acquire, that manifest in the form of imagery, in the same way that the dream is a sort of self-conjured up imagery, at least ordinarily. So I don't think I have a clear opinion regarding that.
Okay, thank you very much. But I don't know, Matthew, we've got some, can I have additional questions, or we should go further?
I think that we've got two themes now. There was originally
okay.
We can drop one of them because the person who wanted to ask the question feels it's already been answered. So the two themes that we've got left are anomalous experiences and the meaning of life. So if it's all right, what I'd like to do, I don't want to be too cheeky of your time, Bernardo. I'm not sure how much we'll get out of you. But,
we can extend a little bit. At some point, I will starve because I haven't had dinner yet. I didn't have time. I wanted to have dinner before this, but we can stretch out a little bit.
Can we pop back to it after we've covered the other two themes? Brilliant, fantastic. So we're not going to ditch it. We're going to come back to it. Right, excellent. So the next theme that we've got is anomalous experiences, which will include things like near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psi, reincarnation, and mediumship. And that starts off with Martin asking for how we can account for these sorts of things. Martin.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I would like to kick off this discussion. I've been reading quite a lot, and that's where I started actually on psi, so paranormal experiences. Actually, it was a book of Dean Radin that I was reading. There I saw somewhere stating Bernardo Kastrup, and I was started to be curious and said, hey, how about that? And you know what? Now I'm in a book club for Bernardo Kastrup. Actually,
Real
wonderful.
Magic was a book, right?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it is a wonderful experience to be in this club, by the way. I mean, thanks a lot for writing the books. Otherwise, I would not have been in this club, and this club is really nice. I mean, the people are really great, and we have a really great atmosphere. I can recommend you to join every now and then. It's really cool. And the discussions are really awesome, and very interesting people and where some of these people had some of these experiences that I would just that Matthew so nicely mentioned, like NDEs and also people that had paranormal experience. At least that's what I heard so far. On the other hand, we also have we have a lot of discussion, especially about psi, which is in the mainstream science often referred to as woo-woo science, and not always accepted by science. And it was one of the things is how do you see like research that is done by Dean Radin or Dick Bierman and many others, and at the same time Dean Radin has also been involved in this double split experiment where he used meditators that were doing they were trying to influence the results of the double split experience with their minds, so by meditation. And I was wondering if you had some clues about that. And further, I would like to open this discussion. So especially also the people that had NDs, I hope to hear them as well, because I think that is always very interesting and it always amazes me. So maybe we can start this off a little bit with how do you see the research that's been done, for instance, by D. Radin, Dick Bierman?
I think there are some very serious, very rigorous scientists doing research in this area. I have personal acquaintance with the DOPS group at the University of Virginia Medical System, the department, what's it called, of perceptual studies,
Correct.
DOPS, yeah. I've been there several days, and I have great respect for what they do. I think these are researchers that are more rigorous than most because they are very keenly aware that they have to be double rigorous in order to have a chance to be heard at all, because their topic is so polemical that it's not level playing field. Their research tends to be of a comparatively higher quality than other experiments in the sense of the protocols they use, double blind, triple blind, all kinds of controls, things that you don't see at all, for instance, in most of the psychology papers that are published, which procedurally speaking are quite weak, and yet people respect it. And never mind that 60% of them cannot be reproduced by peers, 60% of those results, but nobody's saying that it's a woo-woo, nobody is demeaning them or insulting their character. So it's not level playing field, and I'm very sensitive to that. I don't know Dean personally. I've been in a closed email discussion group with him for years. I respect everything that he has posted there. He has come across to me as a very reasonable, very observant, very careful scientist of a high caliber, even though I do not know him personally, like I do know the people from the University of Virginia personally.
You said that you were writing a book with them together. Is that already
That is
published?
correct. Yeah, it's finished, but it's not published.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the third installment of a series that began with Irreducible Mind, and then Beyond Physicalism, and now we will have Consciousness Unbound. At least that's the tentative title. If somebody watches this and realizes I said something I shouldn't say, shouldn't have said, sorry in advance. Now, how do I regard it? I think there is a common characteristic of many of these psi phenomena, and that has to do with acquiring information beyond space-time limitations. So precognition is about this, telepathy is about this. So a lot of it is related to knowing things that you shouldn't know if your consciousness is really bound by the space-time limitations of your body. I would try to make metaphysical sense of that in the following way. I think a ordinary living organism with ordinary patterns of brain function and activity is what dissociated mentation looks like from across the dissociative boundary. It's the image of a dissociative, strongly dissociative process in universal consciousness. But it is possible that the boundary of that dissociative process becomes more permeable, more porous under certain circumstances. In other words, it is possible, conceivable at least, that, the levels of dissociation reduce. And if ordinary brain function corresponds to normal dissociation, what kind of brain function would correspond then or be the image of reduced dissociation? I would say reduced or impaired brain function. It doesn't mean that all reduced brain function will correlate with reduced dissociation. Some reduced brain function may correlate simply with the reduction of the dissociative contents, not with the dissociative boundary itself. And that may explain why certain impairments of brain function will lead to lower IQ or to impaired cognitive abilities, because you're not impairing the dissociative boundary, you're impairing the contents within the boundary. But at least some forms of brain function impairment or brain activity reduction, at least some of those should correspond to an impairment of the dissociative boundary itself. And guess what? There is a consistent pattern across the board that relates some impairments of brain function or reduced forms of brain activity, which correlate with extraordinarily enriched inner life. We know psychedelics do that. We know choking does that. We know G-lock or G-force induced loss of consciousness, which is not a loss of consciousness at all, but never mind, does that. We know that brain trauma, physical brain damage under certain circumstances can do that. We know that from a 2016 study of Vietnam War veterans that have a higher propensity to mystical experiences because they have brain damage in certain key regions. We know that from a 2010 study in Italy published by Neuron, that people who undergo brain surgery for the removal of tumors, and which leads then to some collateral damage around the region of the tumor, they display higher levels of self-transcendent experiences. And that's a particularly interesting study because it was a prospective study. It was not a study done after the fact, after the brain damage. Because it was surgery, they could study the patients before surgery and after surgery. And it's a particularly nice study because it's so nicely done in a prospective way. So we know that there is this correlation. Brain imaging study of mediums in Brazil shows that there is a correlation between reduced brain activity in key cognitive areas and the ability to write down more and more complex text, which is a puzzle. It's difficult to make sense of that. So I think what's going on there in many of these psi phenomena that entail access to information you shouldn't normally have access to, I think what's going on there is simply a reduction of the dissociative process, dissociative boundaries that are more porous, more permeable, and which allow then you to experience things that are in fact beyond the boundaries of your alter. And through some mechanism of memory, you can bring back the access, the key to access those experiences that in fact were not in your alter. You laid down some memory access pathways because of that permeability that allow you to go back through memory to an experience that originally originated outside.
I think that's probably the same with people that had an NDE, and 45% of people that had an NDE have the after effect that they become more paranormal. At least that's what reported.
That's part of it. May also explain why only 18% of people who had cardiac arrest actually report an NDE. I don't think the laying of those memory pathways happens all the time. It's a particularly lucky set of circumstances that allow for you to have low enough brain activity to have a transcendent experience, but yet enough brain activity to be able to lay out those memory pathways. You know, you got to be particularly lucky. So I think that explains why it's only 18% of the people who report an NDE after cardiac arrest, according to your compatriot Pim Vallommel in the Lancet in 2001. So I think there is an account for that. Now, I would be careful with how far we interpret that. That group, DOPS at UVA, they are well known for decades-long study of reincarnation.
Yes.
Which we then they don't do that because they are scientists. They are not in the business of metaphysical interpretation. I am. And some other people are. And some people tend to interpret that, well, the individual soul survives after death. I think we have to be careful with that because you see, even if your individual agency dissolves upon death, the experiential contents of that which was your alter while you were alive will simply get released into mind at large upon the end of the dissociative process. Now, those things that were sort of confined to the dissociative boundary are freed up once the boundary itself dissolves. And it mixes in with the rest of what's going on in mind at large. All those memories, experiential, episodic events that you retain in your alter get released into a broader context. And that may be what's being picked up by other people or mediums. It does not necessarily imply that your individual agency survives intact after the death of the body, which is not necessarily impossible. It's not even necessarily incoherent from the perspective of analytic idealism, but it is not an implication of the verification of that phenomenon, empirical verification of that phenomenon. It's not a necessary implication of that your individual soul or some form of individual agency survives intact biological death. That's the only thing I would caution against.
How would you then see the okay, there's not research, it is more like anecdotes. Like you were talking about reincarnation, and in hypnotic regression, people have been reporting. So if I look at Brian Weiss or Rob Swartz, I mean, they've been writing books about what people report when they are under hypnosis and during the time of between lives, where they're talking about soul plans and these kind of things. Would you see that matching? Would you see that as a possibility?
Look, I'm not saying that it's a fact that our individual agency doesn't survive. It's very well possible that some level of individual agency survive if the dissociation is hierarchical, and if the body truly is a partial image of that hierarchy, such that the body can disappear, but you simply fall back to another level of that hierarchy, which does not have a physical correlate in perception. It is coherent, it is possible and conceivable, because our perceptual apparatus didn't evolve to pick out everything that, that is metaphysically relevant about nature. It has evolved to pick out only that which is relevant for our survival as an organism. So maybe after a physical body dies, there is something else that you could call a meta body that remains, and it's right there, but our perceptual apparatus simply didn't evolve to pick it out because it doesn't have any impact on our chances for physical survival. It may be causally disconnected from what we call the physical world, and therefore we didn't evolve the apparatus necessary to pick it out. It might very well be. The question is not what could be, the question is what do we have reasons to believe? Do we have reasons to believe in a reincarnation line of an individual entity? Perhaps, I don't know. I don't consider myself versed enough in the evidence to pronounce an opinion. I would just caution that a lot of hypnosis and regression therapy is susceptible to confabulation. And this is a scientific fact. We know this to be the case. A lot of the hysteria back in the 90s about demonic cults with children in the 80s, we know now that all that hysteria was largely based on confabulation. So data from regression and hypnosis, by and large, is not very reliable, which does not mean that it's all untrue. Within a pool of unreliable data, there may be stuff that is true, but the signal to noise ratio is too low for you to reliably pick out the truth from the confabulation. It may very well be the case. I do not know. I can tell you what I hope. I hope my individual agency does not survive at all. My physical death. I've had enough of it. I'll leave it at that.
I know that Fema, you also had some questions, or maybe others also have questions that you would like to ask at this time.
Yeah, so it's not related specifically to that. Hi, Bernardo. My name's Fema.
Hi there. Hi. Fema.
Hi. My question is, you've stated that biology is a representation of conscious alters, and in your book, Dreamed Up Reality, you talk about us living like a collective story. So my question is, at some point in the future, could we collectively tell ourselves a different story? And in that story, could computers or non-biological material be representations of conscious beings?
I don't think my statement that biology is the representation of dissociated alters or the image of dissociated alters, I don't think that is necessarily only a part of the story we tell ourselves. I think it's telling us something intrinsic to reality. How you interpret that, how you quote it with a narrative is a story. Maybe even the particular image it has, you know, a body that stands vertically and has 4 limbs and a head and a pair of eyes. Maybe the particular qualities of the image is a deeply ingrained story that has evolved through evolution. It's encoded even in our physiology. So the particulars of the image is likely a story. I would even go as far and say it's probably a story, the particulars of the image. But the fact that it is the image is not a story. Do you see what I mean? For us to have stories, there must be something fundamental about reality within and upon which a story can evolve. A story cannot be created out of nothing. Some facts must be primitives, must be primary and foundational. And the story goes on top of that, and it codes everything, and it gives qualities to everything. I grant that. So most of what we call our ordinary life in terms of the experiential impact it has on us. Most of it, the vast majority, is probably a story, but that story must be built upon some foundations. It has to stand on something primary. Reality has to have something primary. It cannot be a story that comes out of nothing and disappears into nothing. And I know I'm going to contradict myself shortly on this, but there is a sense in which what I'm saying is right, in my view, although there may be another sense in which it's not, but that's a different context. So forget what I just said.
So
are
you
think,
saying then that like it's primal, that conscious alters are represented in a biological form? That's something that's primal?
I think it's a primary fact that conscious alters have an image. They have something they look like. That's not a story.
Okay.
If we are saying that dissociation, something analogous to dissociation, happens in universal consciousness, then that's a process. And that process will have an image. What that image happens to be, or the particular qualities of that image, may be part of the narrative, but that it has an image, I don't think it's a narrative. I think it's one of the few foundational facts of reality. There must be a few foundational facts upon which we can build our stories. And then once those facts are there, then the storytelling begins at several different levels. There's a collective level of storytelling that's shared by our species and encoded in our physiology. In other words, our physiology is the representation of that mechanism of storytelling that we all share. And that may have to do with some basic characteristics of the physical world. Upon that, there are some cultural elements of a narrative, which has to do with some levels of interpretation of physical reality. And upon that, there is some totally idiosyncratic personal storytelling, which is the story you tell yourself about what your life is and what your life means. So there is a hierarchy of storytelling, but underlying that hierarchy, I do think there are some primary foundational facts, and that alter should have a image is one of those primary facts.
Okay, thank you for answering that.
Sorry, could I add something?
Yeah.
Just for a second, that's kind of related to the question of paranormal experiences, but also this thing you're bringing up about the difference between AI and biology. And I've been thinking recently, sort of based on the work of Rupert Sheldrake, on this idea of biological memory as something non-local that is a kind of resonance with the past. That for me, I think that the essential difference between artificial intelligence and memory in computers and biological existence is this difference in the type of memory, whereas in computers, memory is something sort of localized. It's a switch within within a physical system. In biology, I think it's probably something non-local, whether it's exactly what Rupert Sheldrake describes or something analogous. And so I was wondering what you thought of that, whether you see the same difference between biological systems and artificial intelligence, and why AI might not be conscious.
I think we have no reason. I mean, when it comes to things that we understand, we never make a mistake between a simulation and the thing that is simulated. We never make a mistake. I can program liver function in my computer and simulate that down to the molecular level, but that will not make me believe that my computer will pee on my desk, because we are keenly aware that a simulation of liver function is not liver function. I can simulate fire on my computer down to the molecular details, all the ionization processes, the release of photons, the oxidation processes. But I will not believe that my computer will actually catch on fire if I simulate fire down to the molecular details on my computer, because I know that a simulation is not the thing simulated. But when it comes to consciousness, because it's such a mystery under materialism, we completely give up on all of our intuitions of plausibility. And we think if we simulate a brain, then that simulated brain in a way is the brain because it's also consciousness. I submit to you that this is a cultural artifact. It's an absurdity. A simulation is not the thing simulated. Doesn't matter how accurate it is, because the simulation is an abstraction in another substrate of relevant characteristics of the thing simulated. But that you abstract relevant characteristics and you reproduce them in another substrate in a way that honors those abstracted characteristics doesn't mean that you copied the original, that you created another instance of the original. A simulation is an abstraction. Nobody thinks that if you simulate the liver, you will spit out bile, but people think that if you simulate the brain, you spit out consciousness.
But
so
perhaps if we were to try to achieve abiogenesis and sort of create a conscious, you know, an artificial creation that's conscious.
That's different.
I've been wondering whether, you know, the conceptual step that we need to take is to engage with like this theory of morphic resonance and try to create something that is utilizing morphic resonance as memory instead of you know, computer chips.
I think it will happen by itself. It will come with it. It's built into it, because abiogenesis, you're basically creating life from non-life, which I think eventually will be possible. But then you're not simulating a dissociated alter. You are triggering the formation of a real dissociated alter.
Right.
So I'm not simulating kidney function on my computer. I'm taking a 3D bioprinter and constructing a kidney from scratch. And then that kidney will produce urine, and it will urinate on my desk, because it's no longer a simulation. It's a reconstruction of the phenomenon from scratch. If we do that, then I think it will come with the territory that memory is a non-local phenomenon, a sort of way for us to punch through the apparent boundaries of space-time and relive something that's no longer in the present. Because it's inherent to life, I think.
Yeah. Do you have any idea how dissociation can happen? I know that this is a mystery, but do you have some feelings, you know, about it?
I can.
Can we save that one till the end? Because we've just got one last theme to go, and we'll be very close to being able to come back to it. I know Sljana wants to get stuck in with the meaning of life. So if we can just do that first, and then we can come right back to it. How does that sound?
Yeah. Can I?
All right, I'll hand over to Sljana.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. And hello, Bernardo.
Hi there.
Yes, hi. Well, first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude for you, for being with us and actually sacrificing and being hungry and staying. I don't want to feel guilty, so I will try to keep only and stay within the frames of the question. And of course, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to deepen our understanding. And it is really a privilege to meet you. Thank you so much. And second of all, I would like to mention that it is only thanks to the recommendation of our friend Rupert Spira, whom I've been following for a couple of years, that I started reading your books and became interested in your message. Otherwise, I don't have any scientific background, you know, so I'm struggling to understand your sentences, but I absolutely understand your message. So, and that is the most important to me.
Glad to hear it.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, perhaps because I sometimes judge myself of not doing a good job of it, I was always curious about the secret to a well-lived life and finding answers to questions such as who we are, why we are here, and why we are experiencing so much suffering. Is there a meaning and purpose to existence, and what happens after we die, have been the motivation actually for reading your and Rupert's books and introspecting. So it's only natural that your book, Rational Spirituality, became one of my favorites, and Dreamed Up Reality, by the way. There you provide the answers to all these questions, which make a lot of sense to me. So anyway, in your book, you say that the meaning of life is a gradual return to a unified, boundless state of consciousness, enriched by the understanding and self-awareness accumulated during material experience through transceivers of consciousness. Now, while reading your book, I couldn't help but notice a seeming discrepancy in the way you and Rupert explain the nature of reality. According to Rupert, awareness or consciousness in its essence is whole and complete and satisfied in itself. It does not need anything. It knows itself by being itself. The nature of consciousness or awareness, he uses those terms interchangeably, is to be aware. And just by being aware, it is aware of itself. It is inherently self-aware. I read and hear you saying that existence can have meaning if consciousness somehow is not yet complete. Some of its potentials have not yet been realized, such as the potential for self-awareness. Universal consciousness, you say, is conscious, but it's not self-aware. It's not meta-conscious. The understanding and self-awareness is something that is accumulated during the experience in this human form. So I wonder, then, are you saying something entirely different from Rupert, or are you saying the same thing in a slightly different way? And what would that be? Or maybe I'm completely misunderstanding both of you.
I don't think you are.
Also, does the accumulation of this understanding and self-awareness only serve the purpose of consciousness gradually returning to its boundless states of existence, or can it also become a means by which this understanding is communicated and shared and lived in this dreamed up reality, thus enabling a creation of a happy dream for the dreamed characters or for us?
So let me start with your last question. I think our world here certainly does provide ground for communicating in a way that perhaps wouldn't be possible in another state of consciousness. It's speculative, but I think that's possible. So yes, I think there is an opportunity for sharing. How valuable it is, it's difficult to say because we don't know what the alternative is, but I think there is an opportunity there. Whether that opportunity is meant to create a sort of a solely good dream for all of us, I'm a little skeptical about that because everything about nature seems to be telling us that what we call suffering, pain, and evil seems to be as intrinsic to natural processes as joy and insight
and love and peace and
love
happiness and whatever.
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
they seem to be two sides of the
Mm-hmm.
same coin, and both sides are inherent in the nature of things, apparently, if you look to
Mm-hmm.
nature. I mean, nature is not a pretty picture. What's happening under the grass leaves of your backyard every day is a bloodbath of horrendous proportions. And at the same time, there is love, there is warmth, there is joy, there is all of that as well. So I don't know whether the point here is to sort of amputate one of these natural sides and live only in the other. Maybe if we tried to do that, and even if it were possible at all, we would end up emptying out the other side, which may have value only with the reference of the negative side, if you know what I mean. I don't know. Now, going back to your assessment of Rupert's and my positions, I think you're spot on. There is that difference. At least last time I had over a glass of wine with Rupert, the last status of that conversation was that there was this difference. I am with Schopenhauer in postulating or inferring that mind at large, the transpersonal processes out there are by and large not metacognitive, except insofar as we add metacognition to it. Because once we die, our metacognitive insights also sort of get released into that. Where else are they going to go, right? Once the dissociative boundary disappears, our metacognitive insights too go there. So I'm not saying that it is right now entirely devoid of metacognition, because, you know, after 200,000 years of human life on this planet, at least 30,000 of which with metacognition, we probably seeded it a little bit with one or another cognitive insight, but I don't think it is intrinsically metacognitive the way we are intrinsically metacognitive. at least to some extent, we have intrinsically some extent, some level of metacognition. And that seems to be a difference with Rupert. Rupert sees awareness as inherently self-aware.
Self-aware, yes, I know.
So beyond the boundaries of a human being, awareness is inherently self-aware. I will run the risk of being presumptuous here, which is not what I'm trying to do. But since there is this difference, I will risk a hypothesis about what this may be coming from. And I would do this with profound respect for Rupert, somebody I respect totally, which is something I don't say
me too.
very,
we
very
share
often.
That. Yes.
Yeah. I think this may to some extent be attributed to our different ways of coming to conclusions. Rupert, because he is following a spiritual tradition, his way of deriving conclusions is introspection. That's his key cognitive tool, is to introspect, go past the chaos of narratives, try to look at what is behind all that. And then he will find something there. And that something, by the nature of the inquiry, will be self-aware, because that's the nature of his way of inquiring. He is using his self-awareness to explore his awareness. So once he peels off the onion, what will be left is the very self-awareness that he was using as a tool all the way along. It is very difficult when you are counting on introspection. It's very difficult to abstract from that which you are. And we as humans are intrinsically self-aware. So it's difficult to abstract away from that when your tool is introspection. You're introspecting into that which you are, and you are self-awareness. What do you think you're going to find?
Yeah, or perhaps what he means when he says, I awareness know my thoughts, or I awareness am aware of, perhaps he means I, that localized, limited awareness in the form of mind, or what you're saying, metacognition, knows whatever it knows and is aware of everything. And of itself also.
He will deny that. And I think he will deny that with reason. And I would defend him. I would defend him now in that denial. Our human configuration of consciousness, it's a particular configuration of the transpersonal subject. The one subject that's going on, the core subjectivity in us all, the universal subject, acquires a particular configuration of consciousness in the form of human beings, in which it sort of turns in upon itself in order to investigate its own awareness. Exactly. That particular configuration is unique to our condition as humans. This is what being human means.
Or as human mind.
The human mind, that configuration that's turned in upon itself, like a wave that turns in upon itself. Mm-hmm. That particular configuration is intrinsic to the human condition, not to universal consciousness. Yeah. However, if you think of that configuration as a tool, a tool of metacognition, think of it as a tool. Mm-hmm. What you will find at the end by means of that tool is the universal subject, which is not human.
Yeah, that's the only one which is left. Yes, exactly.
So the tool is inherent to our being human, but the subject you will find at the end, if you look through that telescope, is the universal consciousness.
Exactly.
But it's very tempting and natural even to then attribute to that universal consciousness the ability of the tool to look at itself, because that's the means by which it has found itself.
Exactly. Or what Rupert would, yes, I do. Or Rupert would say, the knowing with which I know is the consciousness, is the
universal subject.
The universal subject, yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
But the modality or the tool that you use to see that is metacognitive. And then you naturally attribute that metacognition to the thing that is seeing, because it is seeing through the lens of the tool you used to see it.
Wow.
Now, I may be extremely presumptuous to try to explain away Rupert's position from this perspective. He could very well make an analogous argument towards me. He could very well say, look, Bernardo, you're not using introspection. You are using empirical evidence and reason. In other words, you are trying to arrive at the answers by looking through the lens of the illusion. What chance do you have to have a reliable answer if you do that?
I get it, yeah.
So it is not a simple thing to sort out objectively and say Rupert is right and Bernardo is wrong, or Bernardo is right and Rupert is wrong. I'm trying to convey to you the complexity of the issue, which he and I see over a glass of wine every time we sit together. All I can tell you is that I tend very strongly, despite acknowledging what he might say against my view, I tend very strongly with the last fiber of my being to the position that mind at large is not intrinsically metacognitive, that it is metacognitive only through us and by virtue of what we add to it in the form of being humans. And I would go as far as to say that this is the meaning of life. Otherwise, it's a futile dance. No, we leave a certain place, we go through all kinds of crap, and we go back to where we started. It seems futile to me. And that may, he could say, well, that's the reason you're prejudiced, because you want to find meaning. That may be correct. That may be correct.
Yeah, the only thing is it looks very slow process, though, when you look at the shape of the world and the shape in which we are as humans. I mean, if the meaning of the goal, of the purpose of existence is acquiring and using and sharing and communicating this meta-consciousness, I'm thinking, oh my God, when? How long will it last? How long will it take?
I have observed, and I'll be speaking against myself now, I have observed that different people, or even the same person in different moments or different periods in their lives, have completely different apprehensions of what meaning means. Recently I've taken up a new hobby, because I've left the tech world, the technology world, and I miss a connection with that. So, and I am a computer engineer. That was my very first degree when I was just 22. So I have taken up the hobby of creating my own little 8-bit computers. I do my own stuff, because when I was a kid, I wanted to be a computer engineer to build my own computer, which I ended up never doing, because in the 90s, when I became an engineer, computers were too complex for one single person to build one. Back in the 80s, 5 people would get together and build one. In the 90s, it was 200. So I built lots of processors, but I never built a computer. So now I'm building my own 8-bit computers on my own. And in the process of doing that, there is a part of me that I sense which says, this is too the meaning of life. It's enjoyable. It's creative. You're expressing yourself. It's not about some final insight, some final metacognitive apprehension of the nature of everything. It's that too, but it's not only that. It's also about enjoying the moment and expressing yourself.
Exactly.
So yeah, that goes, it doesn't contradict my story, but it adds something to it that I normally don't talk about. So
Can I
yeah,
just
maybe.
ask a question here?
Thank you.
In one of your books, you write about the meaning of life, the purpose of life, which I really appreciated. But I haven't heard you talking about it afterwards. What you were describing was basically that if mind at large is everything, there's no inflow of information.
No, there is only an expression of inherent potentials that were already there from the beginning, because they are part of what is.
I haven't heard you about describing it in such a way afterwards. Is it something that you change your mind about that?
No,
or is it...
absolutely not. I mean, you're hearing it in different words. When I talk about metacognition being the meaning of life, I mean exactly that, is to become explicitly aware of potentials that were that from the beginning, but only in potentiality. And they only become explicitly expressed under the light of self-awareness or metacognitive awareness. Jung talked extensively about it in his corpus. He said that human consciousness, which was his word for meta-consciousness or metacognitive awareness, is what makes the world be real in that sense of manifestation. It's what makes the world truly manifest. What is implicit, what is there only in potentiality, only becomes truly manifest when engaged under the light of metacognitive awareness. So it's the same thing. There is nothing that comes from the outside. Everything is already there from the beginning in potentiality. And the whole game is the explicit awareness of those implicit potentials. In other words, bringing them to concrete metacognitive manifestation. And that's the difference. There's nothing new in the system, but there is something, there's nothing new in the system that's coming from the outside, but there is something new that has grown in the system out of what it is, out of what it already was from the beginning. You can look at it as a kind of unfolding. When a flower opens up, nothing has been added. The petals were already there, all the structures were already there. They just sort of boom, popped open. But what a difference that makes, doesn't it?
Mm.
Well, that's wonderful. Sorry, I need to jump in, but again, a bit conscious of the time. I wanted to say potentiality. What an amazing word to rather than actuality. I wanted to say, Tom said something in the comment section that in the chat, is there something that I'd like to share? Just prioritizing the people who haven't spoken, or is that fine? Can we skip that? Tom?
You're
Oh, you're muted. You're still muted. Oh, yeah.
Okay. How's that? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Brilliant.
Okay. From a near-death experiencer, I just wanted to interject a few things. I had to chuckle a little bit when somebody referred to near-death experiences as anecdotal information, because if you have one, it doesn't feel anecdotal at all, right? It's unbelievable, actually. There's a saying that in an infinite universe, anything that can happen will happen an infinite number of times. I will say as a near-death experiencer that nothing happens and everything exists simultaneously. So this whole thing, when you talk about the foundation for existence, Bernardo, having a physical aspect to it, I can live with that if the physicality is only apparent. Okay, it's apparent physicality. But just my summary comments are, the revelation I had was that ultimate existence is pure, profound love. And then the two that I've been struggling to incorporate for 50 years, which brought me to Bernardo and quantum physics, was that both motion and time are illusions. I think time was easier for me to grasp as an illusion. Motion was much more difficult, but I finally have figured it out. So any comments from the group?
Can I comment briefly on what you said? Tom, I have profound respect for direct experience. And I think whatever people say about the anecdotal character of evidence, it doesn't matter to you because you've been there. You know it, and you should never discard what you know directly for the sake of an abstraction, which is what the culture endorses or doesn't. I used the word anecdotal in a technical sense, not in a pejorative sense. Okay. Unbelievably enough, there is a technical meaning to that word. And maybe the choice of syllabus was unfortunate because it sounds so pejorative, but the technical meaning is this: evidence is anecdotal unless it has statistical significance and is collected under controlled conditions. Right. Which is usually not the case under NDE. Nobody can do a prospective NDE study because nobody will kill you for a little while and see what you come back to tell us. I mean, there was a film in which they did that, and Flatline in 91 or 92. But no funding agency will grant permission to, or ethical committee will grant a permission for this study. So the best that can be done is what Pim Valomon did. As a cardiologist, and he was seeing people, die and come back all the time. So that's the best he did. His evidence is not anecdotal in the main lines, but when you go to the richness of the details of an NDE, unless we find other people that are saying exactly the same thing you're saying, technically it must be considered anecdotal, although it's not dismissible, if you understand what I mean. It's the difference between what you know to be true and what we as a culture can reliably believe to be true. That's the only difference. And what you report, that space and time are illusory, no, it's very consistent to what we've been talking about here today, that space and time are categories of cognition that exist by virtue of the way our perceptual apparatus has evolved. Once you're free from that, of course, you would transcend space and time. You would transcend that particular mode of cognition. So yeah, I am with you all the way there.
Have you been familiar with Christopher Bosch's work on LSD in the mind of the universe?
No, I'm
He was
afraid
a
I'm not.
professor who kept secret for 20 years doing large doses of LSD monthly. I think he did like 52 sessions, 82 sessions. And it took him all the way to the end of time. And get his audiobook or read his book. It absolutely, the thing that blew me away the most was his courage to put his existence to be completely dissolved, to tell the story that he tells. A very, very profound story.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, such a very good book. I think that what the challenge has to be grounded. Going on LSDs like trips, it's can sometimes take you to the far end where you just get stuck there and it's hard to come back. But I found it very good, so very recommended. I'm aware of the time, Bernardo.
Nor, can I ask a short question, really short question, Bernardo, because I'm so curious. Bernardo,
if I collapse here, it's
short, really short. In last interview with Michael Egner, you admitted that besides of behind the curtain, maybe a creator. Do you think that the creator may be treated as a person? In the broad sense of personship?
There is a sense in which yes, and there's another sense in which absolutely not. I'll tell you the sense in which it can. Our core subjectivity is the core subjectivity of universal consciousness. I think that's the conclusion of the whole line of thought behind analytic idealism. Not only analytic idealism, because I felt forced by my peers to give it a modern name. Idealism, which is something that has existed, forever, even in the Western tradition. I think that's the conclusion you arrive at. So insofar as what we are is core subjectivity, then you can think of God as a person, because God, the creator, is the same core subjectivity. But insofar as what characterizes our state is dissociation, limitation, localization, then you absolutely should not attribute those to the creator.
I mean, in the perfect sense, without any psychological, let's say, assumption about the hesitation, about the, additional.
I think eventually, if and when the dissociation, your dissociation, ends completely, I think that what you will be telling yourself at that moment will be this: oh shit, it was really me. Because when people like me say, your individual self will not survive death, it will only be the core subjectivity that is really you. Most people think, oh, that means it's not going to really be me. It's going to be this other thing, this universal consciousness. What people don't realize is that what I mean is precisely that it's really, really you. It's just not the you think you are right now, but that visceral recognition of your core subjectivity, your core self, that will be there. Let me give you an example. During a dream, you think you are a dream avatar, and you are dissociated from the parts of your mind that are conjuring up the rest of the dream. And the other people, the cars, the roads, the trees, you're dissociated from that, and you identify with that little avatar of your dream. When you wake up, your avatar is dead. It disappears, the dissociation ends, you realize, oh, actually, I was dreaming up the whole thing, including the trees, the cars, the street, the whole thing. but your avatar is dead. Do you mourn the death of your avatar when you wake up? Do you go like, oh, what I really was actually ended, and now I am some abstract universal consciousness? No, no, you realize, no, it's really me. Oh, darn, it's really me. It's just that I never was that avatar. That's what I think would happen. In that sense, yes, the real you is the creator, and I think that will be the most flabbergasting insight that your consciousness will ever have. Will be that moment when you go like, ah, it was really me. It is really me all along. And the second flabbergasting insight was, oh, darn, I am alone. That may explain dissociation to some extent. I don't know.
Well, panentheism would say that it's both, right? That it's both.
Yes, yes, there is, yeah.
That there is immanence and transcendence simultaneously.
I wouldn't even counter that, because in my language it would be core subjectivity. The one true universal subject is immanent in all of us, but it is also transcendent in the sense that all that is relevant about it, a lot of it is beyond our dissociative boundary. So it is immanent in us and it transcends us at the same time, in the same way that you transcend your dream avatar, even though you are immanent in your dream avatar. This stuff is not called abstract.
Panentheism.
No, I align with that. I actually wrote a chapter for a book called Pantheism. Pantheism was in the title. I forgot. Somebody else.
It's not pantheism, right? It's
Yes,
panentheism.
But in this book, they use the term pantheism in a generic way as to encompass panentheism as well. And I wrote a chapter in which I basically said, this view is completely consistent with analytic idealism. This was already several years back. So, I will go to eat because otherwise I'll have a sugar low very quickly. But
absolutely, we don't want that to happen because we need to have you for another session, hopefully, when we cover the rest of your books.
I will come back regularly. Don't you worry. I mean, that you guys have a club dedicated to my output is such an honor. I will always come back. But I want to leave you with this thought, which I struggle to convey so often. Because I speak in conceptual terms, analytic terms. That's what our culture needs today. So I acquiesce to that and I speak that language. It may create the impression that I'm talking about something abstract. I'm not talking about something abstract. Core subjectivity is not some abstract, boundless mind that's not really you. No, it is really, really you. That's what I'm talking about. It's just that this really, really, really you is also really, really, really me. That's the thing that's difficult to wrap your head around in a way that you feel from the body. But just stay with this thought. When this dissociation is over, your first overwhelming thought will be, oh shit, it is really me. That's the first thing that will occupy your consciousness. And you have a laugh, you probably have a laugh, immaterial laugh.
Yeah, there was a laugh in that sense, a mental laugh. I think I want to thank you and also thank everyone for all the brain stream of thoughts. My brain is going mental, mental as in crazy, not mental as in mind. And I wanted to say as well, thank you, Bernardo. Your theory is very accurate and very profound, and we are really enjoying those discussions every week. We're going to leave you here. Everyone else, the session has been recorded, so hopefully I'll send you the recording soon, if my Zoom skills are still good. And feel free to stay, but we'll leave Bernardo to go now. And thank you very much.
If you put this up online, Noor, and you can share the link with me, I'll post it
okay, yeah.
across social media.
You can mention that it's from the book club, so maybe more people will join.
Yeah, absolutely. There are new people as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Really.
Enjoy your dinner.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bon appetit.
Thank you, Bernardo.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you, guys.
Bon appetit.
Thank you, Bernardo.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Thank you.